Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm Geoff Shepard. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. And we have a special guest, somebody who has already been on The Gaggle a few times before, a great expert, one of the leading experts in the world on everything to do with Nixon and Watergate. This is Geoff Shepard. He's written several books on Richard Nixon. He was a member of Nixon's defense team during Watergate, and obviously has many interesting insights to impart. So obviously the big news today, Geoff, is the indictment that came down on Trump yesterday. This is his third indictment. He's had one state indictment, and now this is the second federal indictment. And obviously, you know, those of us with a longer memory will recall the treatment that was meted out to Richard Nixon, and all of the massive DOJ and special counsel operation against him, working in tandem with the Democrats. And so with Trump, we've already had two impeachments led by the Democrats. We had a January 6th committee also led by the Democrats, also working in cahoots with the DOJ, both in the case of the first impeachment, where they knew the truth about Hunter Biden and Ukraine, but they kept quiet about it, knowing that this would undermine Trump's defense. And now again, the DOJ is working in cahoots with the Democrats in Congress, as particularly seen in the indictment, which is in many ways is just a rehash of the January the 6th committee. So, Geoff, you know, you're the great expert on Nixon. What parallels do you see between what's happening now and what happened now almost 50 years ago?
Well, thank you very much, George. And Peter, good to be with you. It's just like old times, except my friends in the Nixon White House are no longer at risk. What we went through was something very similar 50 years ago. And it's this difficult situation where the prosecutors get a bit in their teeth and decide you're going to be taken out no matter what. There's this concept called prosecutorial discretion. And it's really the grease that enables the gears of justice to work. Prosecutors are supposed to exercise in good faith some discretion in bringing indictments or not bringing indictments. But what we've seen recently and really kind of over the past couple of years is this single-minded focus on getting Donald Trump, no matter what, with a parallel focus on not getting Hunter Biden, no matter what. And it is not at all surprising that half of the American public is sensing there's a double standard. Republicans, Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and Michael Flynn and Steve Bannon get nailed to the cross, and others, Hillary Clinton and Lois Lerner and Peter Stojek and Lisa Page and Andrew McCabe, all these people who seemingly did parallel wrongdoing, they walk scot-free. And you sit there and say, you know, this isn't random. It's not on occasion people we think should be punished don't get punished. It divides strictly along party lines. And
that was, of course, also true during the Watergate era. And Nixon was very frustrated. He was saying, hey, how come they're going after me? Well, look at all the things that LBJ did. You know, but no one ever bothered to go after him or JFK.
Well, let's go back because, you know, I'm older. I'm 78. I lived through the other times. But this abuse of prosecutorial discretion didn't start with Trump and Hunter Biden. You go back in modern era to Robert Kennedy. You know, his son is running for president, but this is Robert Kennedy back in the 1960s. He was majority counsel of the Senate Rackets Committee under John McClellan of Arkansas.
Yeah.
And he took an intense personal dislike to Jimmy Hoffa, who was president of the Teamsters Union. And Hoffa was a tough guy, and the Teamsters were a tough union. There's no question about that. And Kennedy just hated him. He called him the most dangerous man in America because Hoffa could call a strike, shut down the Teamsters, and all the transportation of goods and services would stop. And Hoffa, for his part, called Kennedy a spoiled little rich kid, and that didn't help. Well, they tried to nail Hoffa, but as a congressional committee, they didn't have the power. All of that changed when Jack Kennedy was elected in 1960 and named his younger brother Attorney General.
Yep.
And then the differences in power and ability to harm changed dramatically. Robert Kennedy personally recruited 20 lawyers to the Department of Justice, to the organized crime section, whose only job was to go after Hoffa. It became known within the Department of Justice as the Get Hoffa Squad, because that was their only requirement. And I've read they presented information to 25 different grand juries. I mean, this was a full court press on a man, not on an issue. They were going to get the man. They had a couple misfires. Hoffa was well represented and really a scrapper, but they nailed him. Finally, they nailed him on 2 separate cases in 1964. Jury tampering in Tennessee. This was a 7-year effort. And then wire fraud in Chicago. Hoffa was convicted
Geoff,
on both.
Just to interject here, what they were accusing Hoffa of course, no other labor union leader ever did. I mean, this, he was unique. My point is, the discretionary element here is that they got him on jury tampering and wire fraud. It's like, I suppose that never happens to union leaders. Okay, I'm just adding a layer to what you're saying.
Absolutely. Hoffa was not a nice guy.
No,
but stuff has come out in the interim that they planted a spy in Hoffa's entourage who was in meetings when he's plotting defense strategy with his lawyers. Hoffa said they had improperly tapped his phones and was using paid perjurers to go after him. And those were accusations, but there's no question they were so eager to nail him that they weren't worried about niceties. Hoffa was sentenced to 13 years in prison, and their thing stood. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy became a senator, ran for president, was assassinated in 1968. And Nixon, when he was elected in 1968, commuted Hoffa's sentence. In 1971, he was sentenced to 13 years, but Nixon let him out after in 1971. And Hoffa was then assassinated. Even today, a mystery that has not been resolved, but it was in the news again this week.
Yeah, it was.
Requesting the FBI release their files after so many years to show the longest unsolved murder in the FBI's history.
But the story was that the condition was that he would stay out of Teamsters affairs. That was the condition that Nixon
the commutation. That was, and Hoffa had no intention of doing that. He wanted back to be president. So from the day he was released, he fought to get that condition removed. The staff guy at the White House who worked on Hoffa's commutation was the president's lawyer, John Dean. And John Dean comes up again, because 3 years later, John Dean becomes Nixon's principal accuser in Watergate. And what happened in Watergate, we're going to switch now from Hoffa to get Nixon. They reassembled many of the same people and many of the same procedures in an effort to bag Nixon, no matter what it took. There was a specially recruited group of prosecutors recruited by Harvard professors Archibald Cox and James Vorenberg, And their job, their only job, was to get Nixon. And they constituted the Watergate Special Prosecution Force. This was 60 lawyers, and they announced at their first press conference they were going to investigate every allegation made against Nixon since he took office in 1969. This wasn't a Watergate investigation. This was a Get Nixon initiative. And of course, they did. They drove Nixon from office in 1974, and they convicted at least 24 of his members of his administration. So it was a total wipeout, and they had the press with them all the way. You know that this was that there was a uniform press. There was no diversity in the press. You couldn't get the other story. It was 3 networks: NBC, ABC, and CBS. 2 influential newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and 2 influential news magazines, weekly news magazines, Time and Newsweek. So unlike today, then there were no podcasts, no talk radio, no Fox, no Newsmax, no alternative. There was a single narrative. And today, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but today we talk about the deep state and people know what we're talking about. The deep state existed back then.
Yep.
We didn't use that name. We talked about the federal bureaucracy, the Eastern liberal establishment, and the permanent government. But it was the same thing. The group, the unelected group that remained in power regardless of the election. And after they bagged Nixon, you know, he's gone, and their thing stood for 30 years. Now, as you pointed out, I was there. I served on the White House staff for 5 years. I was deputy counsel in his defense team. It ended very badly, but I transcribed the tapes. I ran the document rooms holding the files. I briefed the presidential counselors on Watergate from our side. And I wasn't making the decisions. I was just a kid, but I was in the room when they were made. So I learned around 2003, about 20 years ago, that all of the records of the Watergate prosecution force were held at National Archives. They were government employees, and the National Archives maintains these. If you put in Freedom of Information Act requests and they redact the names of the innocent, you can read the records. Well, I've spent hundreds of hours down at the archives looking through this stuff. And what's come to light is 4 batches of documents in just the past 10 years. It started in 2013. There were 3 senior members of the Special Prosecution Force who left early and took their records with them. I think the records that remained to the end got cleansed. There's allusions to stuff that doesn't exist. But these 3 folks left early and took their confidential files with them. Improper, you know, I mean, if their name had been Trump, they'd be 37 different indictments by this time. But nobody knew. All the archives knew was there weren't a whole lot of files from the second special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. Well, he went back to Texas. He resigned early. He resigned when they started the cover-up trial. And he finished his career in Texas, and he gave his papers, all of his papers, to his law school alma mater, Baylor Law School in Waco, Texas. And they took their sweet time arranging them for public access. And then in 2013, they show up, and the archives was encouraged to go have a look because there were grand jury transcripts that were being made public. And archives asked for and took boxes of information back to Washington. They sorted through it. They returned what could be made public. They put aside what couldn't, and they redacted the names of the innocent. And after a 6-month effort, they made them available. And I had a FOIA request pending. So they said, look, this isn't strictly in response, but we just spent months doing this. We need to have this in the public. We're making it available to you first.
Jeff, I'm very curious. I mean, there are very few people like you that have the lived experience. You've done all of the scholarship. You've written books about. So in 2013, going back to that year, I mean, how many people of your expertise are actually still around to be able to look at these documents and make sense of them? Okay.
Well,
if you're just out of law school, I mean, you may have a vague understanding that something like Watergate happened, but have no intimate knowledge of what's going on. I find it really remarkable. There's still people like that can actually say, oh, this definitely can't go into the public.
Well, I am eager to admit I'm the only person, to my knowledge, on our side who lived through it as a young enough person and knows where to look when stuff becomes available. There are still people alive on the other side. Four immediately come to mind, but they've got no interest in looking. They own the status quo. It's why I never get invited to any panels or any reunions, because I'd be the skunk at the family reunion. I've got all these documents that are impossible to justify, impossible to dismiss. These are facts. Remember, John Adams, our second president, once famously said, facts are stubborn things. None of my work has ever been challenged or refuted. It's just not news, because nobody knows what to do with it. So yes, I'm very unique. I know where to look. Let me give you two quick examples, because it's exactly what you're saying. Fred Bazart was my boss, was the top inside defense lawyer. And he told me once he had this conversation with James Neal, who was the lead prosecutor on Watergate. He was the one who bagged Hoffa in Tennessee after 7 years of effort. James Neal said to him, they weren't sure they could put Jeb Magruder on the stand in good conscience because they knew he was going to lie. He was so scared, he'd say anything he thought they wanted him to say. And he said, we can't really use witnesses. We're not sure we can use witnesses like that fairly, ethically. So when I got access, one of the first things I asked for was the material on Jeb Magruder. And sure enough, there's a 48-page briefing paper to prepare the lead lawyer to walk Jeb Magruder through his direct testimony. 48 pages. Ask him where he was born, he'll say this. Ask him where he went to work, he'll say that. And anytime what they thought Jeb might say, because he kept changing, would conflict with prior sworn testimony that he gave or was given by another government witness to the grand jury, sworn testimony, they put an asterisk and said, stay clear of this because we think there's a conflict here. 40 times in that memo, where they were worried that Jeb would say something that was unsupported or untrue, but they still put him on the stand. So yes, I knew where to go look. And when they went after a particular person, because I remember the newspaper, I remember what was going on. I wasn't one of the outside defense lawyers. I was one of the inside, but same thing. I know where to look. Well, I've uncovered dozens of documents, and they're all posted on my website. The links to the National Archive document, because my website, which is www.shepardonwatergate.com, my website is designed to educate future scholars and researchers. I'm giving away my expertise, my knowledge, my research, because I want it shared. I want it out in the public domain. Just yesterday, a senior lawyer from the Irvin Committee wrote me a note and said, I know you got these Leon Jaworski confidential files. Would you share them with me? I've seen the ones you put in the books, but there got to be more. Could you make a set of copies for me? And of course, I don't classify my stuff that way. I classify it by topic. And I wrote back, And I said, they're not at the Department of Justice. They're at the archives. Here's the guy there. You should ask. Many of them are online. If you give me a call, I help you walk through it. By the way, I'm kind of surprised in your email you didn't allude to your former involvement. You know, what kind of sucker do you think I am? But I'm happy to help. He's on the other side, I'm sure. But I'm happy to help direct him to these documents because I'm very confident that he can't refute them. So in any event, there I go. And
what's interesting? Yeah, no, sorry to interrupt. But what's interesting, and I think there's a parallel here with Trump, is that the official view of Nixon is so dominant. The Republicans have embraced that view of Nixon as a monster. Even Kevin McCarthy, when he was talking about impeaching Biden, he said, "Oh, no one has done this since Richard Nixon."
Yeah, they all allude to it. Richard Nixon is
a meme. Nixon isn't even a person anymore. He's a meme.
Right.
He's the gold standard of presidential corruption, even to Republicans. They don't want to fight that battle. One of the great quotes in my first book by Carl Sagan is, quote, "One of the disappointing things of history is once people have been bamboozled, they don't want to be corrected." They've already made their peace with Nixon being the biggest crook they've ever known. Biggest scandal of the 20th century, a little unsure about today, but the 20th century. And I'm standing on the sidelines saying, no, they cheated. I've got a paper trail. They met secretly with a judge. They suppressed exculpatory evidence. They falsely sentenced John Dean. That you weren't told the truth back then. And I have the truth. Nobody wants to hear it. Now, I've written 3 books. I've written dozens of essays. One's going to be published tomorrow. I've got one in mind that's going to be called A Tale of Two Sweethearts, that's going to compare Hunter Biden's with John Dean's, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And I've given dozens of presentations, but they never seem to catch on. They never make news. And the other side certainly doesn't want to debate me, doesn't want to show up anywhere, because, as I say, they own the status quo. It's like, and this may be a rough analogy, why should Trump debate other Republicans when he's so far ahead in the polls? It would only help them. And the other side, the side that owns the status quo, Nixon's a crook and all of his people were like the mob and they got caught and they should have gone to jail. And John Dean is a whistleblowing hero. That's kind of cemented into the meme. And you can't seem to get a fingerhold. So come forward. We got the Get Nixon squad. It was the same people who served on the Get Hoffa squad. As I say, they were recruited for Get Nixon by these 2 Harvard professors. The top 17 of those 60 lawyers had all worked together in the Department of Justice under Kennedy or Johnson. So you had a constitutional inversion. You had the people who lost power when Nixon was elected in 1968 now having the power to investigate and prosecute. And of course, they only investigated one side. It was the exact same thing. And Nixon, George, you alluded to this, it drove Nixon crazy. He's getting dumped on for not ending the war fast enough and for aggressive steps to bring the North Vietnamese to the bargaining table. And he says to himself, wait a second, when I left office in 1961, losing to Jack Kennedy, there were 3 things we knew for sure. Diem was our ally in Vietnam. We were preparing to take out Fidel in an invasion in Cuba, and we had missiles in Turkey aimed at Moscow, secret, but Moscow damn well knew it. And I come back into office in 1968, they're all gone. Diem has been assassinated. Where were we? the Cuban invasion went to hell because Jack canceled the air power. And the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't make him a hero. Shoot, man, we promised to never invade Cuba again and pull our own missiles out of Turkey. And they started leaning on Richard Helms, who was head of the CIA. And they said, we want to know what happened. And Helms said, interestingly, well, you know, the CIA is special. We serve one president at a time, and we don't tell tales. You know, so no, we won't tell you what we did for Lyndon Johnson or Jack Kennedy. That's not going to happen. So if you go back, and I know we're moving fast through all this stuff, you go back to the Plumbers. That was when the Pentagon Papers leaked in 1971, and Nixon went crazy. They set up this unit within the White House to stop leaks. Go find out what Daniel Ellsberg, the great leaker, has in mind, because he's had access to 54,000 other classified documents, and stop leaks as best you can. I know it happens, but we've got to cover down on this.
Why could I just sort of question, why did Nixon, why was he so preoccupied with this?
It had nothing to do with him.
Exactly. It was damaging to Kennedy and Johnson. It didn't have, it wasn't damaging to Nixon.
Let me finish. Remind me, but let me finish.
Okay.
There were two heads of the Plumbers unit. Bud Krogh, who was my boss, who was supposed to stop the leaks and get Ellsberg, and David Young, who was contributed from the domestic council side, John Ehrlichman's staff. David Young was contributed from the NSC. He was one of Kissinger's top guys. I never understood this, but David's assignment was to declassify all of these overly classified documents. Well, I think they had to do with the Diem's assassination in the Bay of Pigs and the Turkish missiles. And that was what you said. Nixon was beside himself because Johnson gets blamed for nothing. You know, and the narrative is Nixon is this warmonger, you know, who's bombing the women and children of Cambodia on Christmas Eve. And no let up in the criticism of Nixon. Whereas when Johnson, a Democrat, was in charge, nobody seemed to care very much. Now, why did Nixon get upset over the leak of the Pentagon Papers? Because the Pentagon Papers stopped with Lyndon Johnson. There wasn't a single mention of Nixon, possibly as vice president, but way back. And I don't know if your listeners know this, but the Pentagon Papers were posted in full on the National Archives website in 2011. You can go read them, and it's interesting. It's 48 notebooks full of study, starting with World War II and our relationships with Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese, going up to the end of Lyndon Johnson's tenure. And it's really too much to go through. I mean, it is whoever tied their shoe on the third day. But every once in a while, there's an executive summary. And if you print out the executive summaries, you got a stack about an inch thick, which is much easier to read. And I got to tell you guys, it is fascinating. And nobody knows this. Nobody cares. It will be my fourth book. I've done the research, but I haven't gotten around to writing it. The Pentagon Papers was a secret study done by the three most senior anti-war officials in the Department of Defense, started on a casual remark from Robert McNamara. It was Paul Warnke, who was general counsel, Morton Halpern, who was one of the lead intellectuals against the war, and Les Gill. And they had this huge project underway because apparently Warnke said to Bob, you know, we ought to look into how we got into this mess so it doesn't happen again in the future. And apparently McNamara said, sure. Well, the study was massive. It wasn't peer-reviewed. It wasn't shared with the Department of State or elsewhere in the Department of Defense. or even the National Security Council. When it leaked, they didn't even know it had been written. And here you got, of course, it's according to the narrative, it's God's will because it came out of the Department of Defense. It wasn't policy. It wasn't adopted as the one be all and tell all. And it was written, chapters were assigned to different people. Okay, general this would do this, general that would do that. And it started again in World War II, goes up to the Geneva Accords in 1954.
When was the study completed? Do you know which year it was actually completed?
Yeah. There's this fake transmittal letter on January 19th, 1969, the day before Nixon is inaugurated, that sends it to Clark Clifford, because Robert McNamara is long gone. Clifford is SecDef. Here's the study, except it wasn't done. It was only 36 volumes at that point. So the guys, Mort Halpern and Paul Warnke, took the study to Brookings. And it wasn't, remember, if you got classified documents, you got to register and show how careful you are with the documents. They, as we know today, the military takes these classifications very seriously.
Very seriously.
Civilians, not so much. It seems of much ado about nothing. This study wasn't even registered as being at Brookings, but they kept working on it for 6 months, even though technically some of them were employees of the Nixon administration. Never said a word. Then it ends up out at the Rand Corporation. And Ellsberg's out there. He worked on the study. That's why he knows it exists. And he starts taking it home over weekends and photocopying it. Remember, it's 4 volumes long. It's huge. And he peddles it, and he can't find any takers. It's highly classified. And he keeps going to, who's the foreign relations senator from Arkansas? Fulbright. And he keeps saying, look, you got to talk about this stuff. You got to publish this stuff. We're not in a legitimate battle. We had no reason to go to fight in the first place. And Fulbright says, you give it to me officially, unclassified, I'll deal with it, but I'm not taking your stuff. And he finally convinces the New York Times, June of 1971, and out it comes. I want to go back to these summaries, because Les Gelb did all the summaries, but he's summarizing work done by different people. So you have, as one chapter, the lead up to the Geneva Accords in 1954. You have the Geneva Accords. You have the aftermath of the Geneva Accords. And I'm skimming, so I might be going through this too fast. The French bailed out after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. We stepped in. Roosevelt had been adamant, no more colonies. What these European nations did to these colonies was unconscionable after World War II. No more. But Roosevelt died, Truman took his place, and the great scare was France is going to go belly up. The dominoes are falling in Southeast Asia. You know, China's fallen, Korea's falling, Vietnamese are divided. And that we've got to let France hold on to them. And of course, it didn't work. We had to step in. The original dividing line was the 17th parallel. And after we renegotiated it, it became the 16th parallel. So there are people caught in a parallel in no man's land. And again, I'm skimming on this. I didn't prepare for this part. The French had converted huge numbers of people in Hanoi. Hanoi was the capital of Vietnam before the war. And that's where all the diplomacy was and all the French influence. Well, when they divided the country, these people are on the wrong side. and they got to physically get down to the South to live. Because when they did land reform under the commies in the North, they killed everybody. So these folks show up in the South, they're loyal to France, but they own no land. They're not natives. They're out of nowhere. And the peasants, whether they were Hindus or Buddhists, doesn't matter. They don't care. They're scraping by on teeny little farms on just a few degrees above starvation. They don't want to fight. So what happens? U.S. doesn't even sign the Geneva Accords. We disowned them. Not we disowned them. We refused to become signatories. And then you start getting into what are we going to do to protect Diem, nominally a Democrat elected, legitimate president of South Vietnam. The folks won't fight. The South Vietnamese won't fight. The only thing we can agree on, everybody's happy about this, is let's go bomb the North. We don't lose many soldiers. They don't have to die in battle in the jungles. And we'll hurt the North Vietnamese, and we'll force them to the negotiating table. Well, the U.S. says, we shouldn't have to fly from Guam, so it evolves into we'll build airfields in South Vietnam, and we'll build them right along the coast, so they can be protected by our Navy. We don't have to risk soldiers. So we built 3 airfields right along the coast of South Vietnam. And then the worry became, the pilots can't defend the airfields and the South Vietnamese aren't any good. We better put some sailors, Marines.
But just jumping ahead a little bit, I mean, my recollection is that the most damaging part of the Pentagon Papers was the assassination, the overthrow and the assassination of Diem, because the Kennedy administration was very actively involved in it.
Yeah,
they got on very badly with Diem. Diem didn't really like the Americans. Diem was much more oriented
Absolutely
towards
true.
France.
Well, let me.
So again, why
you're-
would Nixon be upset? This is really damaging to Kennedy and Johnson,
Yes,
particularly
you're very
Kennedy.
kind. I wandered off. Too much detail. Nixon and Nixon's people didn't care. They said this is Johnson's problem. Let it roll.
Jeff, we are detailed junkies. I'm
Okay,
thoroughly
okay.
enjoying
Absolutely.
it. Okay?
It was Henry Kissinger that went in, just pitched a hissy fit and said, listen, I am negotiating with 3 totalitarian regimes in secret, North Vietnam, China, and Russia. If they conclude we can't keep secrets, we're doomed. And the FBI actually told the White House that a copy of the Pentagon Papers had been dropped at the Soviet embassy. And they were told every time they alluded to some writing or some memo in the papers, those documents were attached in the last 4 volumes. And that's why the hugely secrecy stuff, and why it was the worst leak in the Cold War, because if you had our code and you had the electronic transmission coming out of Saigon, and now you had the document itself, you could break all our codes. And I was told by people, remember, I'm on the domestic side, that U.S. allies had died. People had died because of the leak of the Pentagon Papers. So Nixon got in it, got furious, got everybody all riled up. And the difficulty in retrospect was they hired Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt to be the operation officers for the Plumbers. They messed it up. And worse, it was the same team, Liddy and Hunt, supervising Cubans, who committed the Watergate break-in several years later. Now, the Watergate break-in was the invention and the project of the re-election campaign. It didn't lead into the White House, but that team had conducted the Ellsberg break-in for the Plumbers at the direction and under the control of the White House. So that's the major reason for the cover-up, was to keep Liddy and Hunt and the Cubans' involvement in the Ellsberg break-in, Ellsberg shrink, from public knowledge. And ultimately, of course, it blows up, and and it goes down from there.
There's something George and I have been talking about with Trump's documents.
Yeah.
I'm not prone to hyperbole, but George, I think I tripped upon it because George makes me think all the time. Is it, and you're a documents guy, big time. It seems to me the Mar-a-Lago case, which a lot of people think has some currency, meaning against Trump, but it seems to me that they're going to use this as a predicate to start erasing the Trump presidency completely. I mean, done. It's all classified. You know, the ongoing investigation, litigation, and it seems to me that they really, the fanaticism of that side, our opponents, is that they want to wipe his presidency white, gone.
Well, you know, if you're old enough, you remember the hatred of Richard Nixon.
Yes.
He was blamed. Yeah. He was blamed for the war. 537,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam when he becomes president, but he's blamed for the war.
Yep.
That hatred, and I think to some extent legitimate, because I mean, I was one of the guys subject to the draft during that 10-year period, and there were three things you knew for sure. If you were drafted, you were going to Vietnam. If you went to Vietnam, you were going to be assigned to the field, and if you were assigned to the field, you're going to die. So the resistance to the war was huge. I maintain today's hatred of Trump, which is considerable, bears no like comparison to the vehemence with which they hated Nixon and the narrative that Nixon was a crook. So I would say, sure, they're trying to wipe Trump out, wipe him off the map. That's what they tried to do and succeeded with Dick Nixon.
Well, that's the reason why I ask it. I mean, sure, there are people like you that have tons and tons of information in your head. But as we've already agreed in our conversation here, is that Nixon has become a meme. I mean, nobody cares about the minutia, okay? But the minutia count.
Let's interrupt this.
But this is why, I mean, there's
one point. Let me make one point.
Okay.
I've written 3 books. I've given all these speeches. We put this play on off Broadway. We are working on 2 things. One is a documentary based on my documents. It always comes back to my documents. That's being prepared for release next summer because we're creeping up on the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation, which is next August 9th, 2024. So we hope to have this documentary out. Now, I grant you, even if it's shown, even if we're successful in placing it, it won't change many minds.
Well, Geoff, send it my way. I may have a way to help you get international distribution.
Well, we're doing a conference call later this afternoon. We're right in the heat of it. The other thing that's going on behind closed doors, you remember I transcribed the White House tapes and we published them. Let me turn around just for a second. We published them in 1974. This is the submission of recorded presidential documents. And I published that book. It's transcript of about 4 dozen Watergate tapes. And it was hard work. It didn't change the people's mind because they didn't read it. It didn't matter. They denounced Nixon as being petty and human and vindictive, which he is. But they didn't have the tapes from the other presidents to compare. We did it under duress. We did it on terrible acoustical quality tapes. Today, there's a tape expert on the Nixon tapes, Professor Luke Nichter out at Chapman University, and he runs a website called nixontapes.org. And he's had more time and he's put in a huge effort to produce improved transcripts. Now, I know him. I've worked with him for years. What he lacks, because he's a young man, he lacks the context of what they're talking about, which, as we've pointed out before, I was around and I did the first cut. So he and I are embarked upon this great adventure. The goal is to reissue this volume. It's called the Blue Book because of that blue cover. Reissue it with better transcripts, more accurate transcripts, annotated for future scholars to know what on earth they're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we expect, if we do it honestly and forthrightfully, it will become the agreed upon source for Watergate tapes for research from friend and foe alike. At least we'll agree this is the best we can do on the transcript. It's interesting. Archives takes the position there are no official transcripts. The archival record is the tape itself. Go have a listen. Well, those tapes are so bad, it hurts to hear the words.
Yeah.
It hurts. And you're concentrating word, 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 word. Is this a sentence? What's going on? Who's talking? And you're so in the woods, you lose the big picture. But if you just read the transcript, you lose the tonation, you lose the emphasis, you lose the timing. But we think if we get defensible transcripts, there are lots of people who've done transcripts and they've got huge errors. Luke said the other day, he thought there were no more than 10,000 errors in the original transcripts. And he's talking about me. so I don't blame him. And we're deep into the project. We hope to publish by next year. But basically, 10 o'clock every morning, we've taken the summer off, but 10 o'clock every morning, if he and I are both free, we start with a transcript and we start going through. When Bob Haldeman says, well, he told us, who's Bob talking about? You know, is it Dean? Is it Ehrlichman? Is it Magruder? You know, and
Geoff, what drives you to do this? This is an amazing endeavor on your part. I mean, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary, and you won't let it go. And I think that's really
like
amazing.
My wife. You sound like my wife. I'm doing, Peter, I'm doing lots of things. I'm doing podcasts like this, comparing, you know, Get Nixon and Get Hoffa. I'm doing the tape project. I'm doing the documentary project. In 2010, I started producing Nixon Legacy Forums, co-sponsored by the National Archives, where we'd get people who worked on a particular topic to come to archives, sit on the stage, and talk about the documents they had produced. Desegregation of the Southern schools, opening to China. And since 2010, I helped produce 36 Nixon Legacy Forums, and they're all posted on my website if people care to look. We're working on another one. We're going to do one in August. We're going to do one in the fall on the Office of Telecommunications Policy. Now, nobody remembers, nobody cares, but that was the change from wired transmissions to satellite.
Look, Geoff, could we just go back to a point Peter made a few minutes ago? He was saying how this is all an attempt, particularly the Mar-a-Lago case, to erase the Trump presidency.
Yeah.
And in a way, Watergate was also an attempt to erase the Nixon presidency. So that Nixon
won
successful. The spectacular landslide, 49 states. I mean, you know, that was an amazing thing.
An amazing landslide voided by progressive Democrats.
That's right. And so, I mean, who had ever heard of prosecuting a former president for mishandling classified documents? I mean, he's the classifier, declassifier in chief. How can you prosecute mishandling documents? But in the same way with Nixon, you know, obstruction of justice. Well, how can you go after a president for obstruction of justice? He is head of the Justice Department, his Justice Department.
It's easy. You don't like him. Let's put him in jail.
Right.
That's the criminalization of politics, which was started under Nixon. Those were the founding people. So the big issue with Nixon himself was, do we indict him or do we impeach him? And they felt indictment was too uncertain, unsettled law. Let's go with the impeachment route. Well, that infuriated the lawyers in the Special Prosecution Force, because Leon Jaworski and Judge Sirica had agreed without consultation with the Cox's army Then after Nixon resigns, everybody said, well, now we can prosecute him. He's no longer president. And they're all geared up to do it. And I think Jaworski, whose heart wasn't in this anymore, Nixon was gone, I think he signaled to Ford's people that he would not be offended by a pardon. They had to bring this thing to a stop. So he goes home. No, Nixon is pardoned, and then he goes home. And his staff goes crazy all over again and says, we'll challenge the pardon. Ford, the successor president, had no right to pardon Nixon. And they say that's because of the guidelines Elliot Richardson agreed to as Attorney General. And they write a memo, I've got the memo, saying those guidelines tied the hands, the constitutional right of subsequent presidents. It's crazy. But it was this maniacal, all-out hatred of Nixon to see him in jail. And it's the same thing with Trump.
We see it again. I mean, here we go. We have operatives in the Justice Department there that are interpreting the Constitution, which is not their job, essentially. Right. It's the Supreme Court that interprets it. And then they create a precedent, and everybody thinks, oh, this is the way it's always been here. But they're doing it again. We have these progressive Democrats subverting the Constitution.
Well,
again, all over again, 50 years later.
The other thing that's so intriguing back then and today, they're after these people for what are called thought crimes. It's not so much what you did, it's what was in your mind when you did it. And if the jury doesn't like you, it's easy to project evil. I noticed yesterday's indictments are all conspiracy. Conspiracy is a thought crime. And at least back in Watergate, I'm going to get another book. Back in Watergate, there was this teacher, professor at William and Mary, Paul Marcus, and this is his case book, say, with all the tabs and everything. This is from 1978, so it's frozen for Watergate. He goes through in great detail the opportunities and challenges of conspiracy charges and how the original purpose, two people doing something are more dangerous than one, and we ought to be able to interrupt before the crime and charge you, has been totally subverted because prosecutors find it much more easy to prosecute for a conspiracy because the guy you're after doesn't have to have committed the crime. It's just, George committed the crime, we're going to nail Peter. It's a conspiracy.
But see, again, this brings us right up to the present because we have the Jan 6 indictments now, and there are co-conspirators. So, Geoff, given the stretch of history, should we be surprised to find another John Dean?
Well, it will be hard. It will be hard. I consider John Dean to be unique in history. Somebody extraordinarily close to the president, or can be shown to have been extraordinarily close to the president, who committed all the crimes, flipping and being made a whistleblowing hero.
My point is, I think common sense dictates the way this indictment's coming down is they've got somebody that's is flipped. Okay.
Well, but they can't be. I mean, maybe Steve Bannon isn't going to flip. Maybe Mark Meadows.
Mark Meadows.
Maybe.
And some of Trump's lawyers flipped. When that judge in DC, Beryl Howell, she managed to break the lawyer-client confidentiality.
The judge did away with lawyer-client privilege.
What's going on?
Only for Trump. Only for Trump. Now, the other thing, and then we're going to have to stop. The other interesting thing about conspiracy is the law was developed, the case law was developed when they were going after the mob. because
Right.
the senior guys in the mob never got their hands dirty. They never touched the guns, never touched the money. So they charged them with conspiracy. And then the court upheld cutting the corner to get these guys because they were evil. Well, then
Rico.
when you apply those same standards in politics, and you don't have to prove, if you allege a conspiracy, then any discussion between the alleged conspirators, hearsay doesn't apply. There's an exception to the hearsay rule. So you get that. That's why prosecutors always throw in a conspiracy charge, because it puts them in far better shape to secure convictions. Okay, now we didn't get a chance to cover two things. So if we want to continue the conversation,
Yes.
I think there are incredible similarities between Hunter Biden's sweetheart deal and the sweetheart deal that John Dean got, even though the public perception was they threw the book at him, but it was all fake. And the perception of Hunter, it looked pretty good, but nobody knew how good until that judge brought it out. So let's reserve that for next time.
Good, yeah, very good for next time. Just a quick question. How much of the convictions that the prosecutors secured of the people involved in Watergate, whether it was Ehrlichman, Haldeman, how much did it depend upon John Dean's testimony?
Certainly the cover-up trial, which was the key of the senior guys, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell. John Dean was the first and primary and essentially the only government witness. He came on, he said, of course there was a conspiracy, I ran it, so I'm positive about that. These guys were in on it. I'm being punished, you should punish them too. I don't know how you defend yourself from that. There were clear meetings with Dean, but they weren't taped unless the president was involved. So it's his word against theirs. And,
So it did depend on John Dean.
Time.
So John Dean's the one who got sent to prison.
Now, interestingly, Dean's testimony against Nixon is not determinative because it's all on tape. And you can fight over what the tape means. I think Nixon learned there had been a cover-up. People had perjured themselves. They were being blackmailed. And he wanted to flush out the truth. The only question was how best to do it. I think that's what the tapes hold. Prosecutors concluded otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Geoff, that was another fascinating trip down memory lane, and with lots of relevant lessons for today. And we definitely need a part 2 to get onto the
I feel
John Dean parallels.
I feel, Geoff, that you're like a mentor to George and I, because I'm so happy that I can keep up. Okay, because
I am too.
Maybe 3 or 4 names you mentioned, I'm still kind of trying to remember, but everybody else, when we talk to you, I'm living through it again. I remember it so clearly.
It's very difficult to explain Watergate to the children. To the people who didn't live through it, because it's so Byzantine. Good. But until next time, thank you both.
Thank you very much, Geoff.
Bye-bye.
See you again very soon. Bye-bye, Peter.
Bye-bye.